It is some time past 10 o'clock, or 11. The house has settled into whatever quiet it makes at this hour. The sounds that belonged to earlier in the day, the voices, the notifications, the small obligations pressing against each other, have finally gone somewhere else. Your body is still, or close to it, but the mind is not. It is not being dramatic about this. It is simply continuing, replaying something that happened this morning, drafting a response to something that has not yet been said. Asking a question about something 3 years ago as if the answer might arrive tonight if it is asked carefully enough. You may have noticed that the thinking does not wait for permission to stop. It does not care that the lights are off. It is not concerned that the body has declared itself done with the day. It keeps going, the way a river keeps going even when no one is watching it. There was a man who spent most of his life thinking about this, not as a complaint, but as a question. He was a physician who became a philosopher, who became a psychologist, who kept returning to the same strange, stubborn fact. The mind does not stop, and what it does when it cannot stop is not random. It is not noise. It is the most distinctly human thing there is. His name was William James. He was born in New York City on the 11th of January, 1842, the eldest son of an eccentric and brilliant father and the older brother of a novelist who would become more famous than he was. He spent the first decade of his adult life unsure of almost everything. He was drawn to science and then away from it. He was drawn to painting and then away from that. He studied medicine for years and then hesitated at the threshold of actually practicing it. He suffered headaches, back pain, depression, and a crisis of will so complete that he wondered seriously and for a long time whether continuing was worth the effort. He did continue, and the reason he continued and the way he continued is the thread we follow tonight. There are 3 things about this evening I would like you to hold gently as we begin. The first, William James wrote one sentence in his journal on the night of the 30th of April 1870 that changed the direction of his life. We will come to it. Not yet, but it is waiting for us. The second, James coined a phrase for what happens in your mind right now. He called it the stream of consciousness. Not the river, not the lake, the stream. There is a reason for that word, and we will find it together. The third, toward the end of his life, James described 2 kinds of human experience, what he called the sick soul and the healthy soul. He placed himself honestly in the first category. But his philosophy did not end there. Tonight we will find out where it does end. Let your body settle where it is, the weight of your shoulders wherever they are, the breath moving on its own without needing anything from you. We begin in the middle of a life that has not yet found its shape. We begin, like many important things, in the moment before the answer arrived. Chapter 2, Boston, 1869. In 1869, William James was 27 years old and had just finished his medical degree at Harvard, though he had no intention of practicing medicine. He had spent years circling the question of what he was actually for. He had gone to Brazil on a natural history expedition with Louis Agassiz, the great comparative zoologist, and had arrived home seasick and uncertain whether science was the life for him. He had gone to Germany to study physiology and had come back with German ideas and a worsening back. He had a father who was impossible in the most illuminating way. Henry James Sr. was a Swedenborgian theologian who had his own history of breakdown, what he called his vastation, a word he took from the mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, a sudden, terrifying experience of emptiness that came upon him one afternoon in Windsor, England, in 1844. While he was sitting alone after dinner, feeling peacefully satisfied, and then found himself gripped by a shapeless dread so intense he could not move. He recovered eventually by immersing himself in theology. He passed to his children a genius for introspection and a certain intimacy with the darker rooms of the interior life. His brother Henry was already writing fiction with the kind of precision that made William feel both proud and slightly outclassed. The two brothers wrote each other constantly throughout their lives. Hundreds of letters that read, even now, like conversations between two people who understood that thinking clearly required someone else to think against. William was not yet teaching psychology. There was no psychology department to teach. In 1869 and into the 1870s, what he would eventually build did not exist in any institutional sense. He began by teaching anatomy, then physiology, then, slowly, a thing he called physiological psychology, which was his way of saying, I want to study the mind, and I want to be honest about the fact that it lives in a body. The city he moved through was Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the years just after the Civil War. The air of intellectual New England was thick with arguments about Charles Darwin, about the nature of consciousness, about whether human beings had souls in the sense the churches meant, or something else entirely, something continuous with the animal world, but reaching somehow toward the distinctly human. Ralph Waldo Emerson was old, but still present in the culture. Henry David Thoreau had been dead less than a decade. The tradition of New England transcendentalism was fading, and something harder, more empirical, more scientific was arriving to replace it, and William James was somewhere at the seam between the two. He was also unwell. The back pain that had begun in Germany had not resolved. He suffered from what we might now call depressive episodes, though the language of his time would have called it neurasthenia, a vague word that covered exhaustion and darkness and the difficulty of getting out of the chair. He read widely and voraciously, as he always had, and the reading both helped and made things worse, because the more he read, the more clearly he saw the problem. The problem was this: if the mind is entirely determined by physical causes, if every thought and feeling is simply the product of neural events that were themselves caused by prior physical events going back indefinitely, then there is no such thing as genuine choice. A thought does not choose itself. A feeling does not choose itself. The person sitting in the chair, exhausted and afraid, is simply the output of forces far older than he is. This was the problem that Arthur Schopenhauer had posed in his way, that certain readings of Darwin posed, that the German materialists posed, and in his darker periods, William James could not find his way out of it. He did not know yet that the way out was not through logic. He would not know that for another year. He was 27 years old, recently credentialed, recently returned from Europe, and entirely uncertain whether what he felt in the chair was despair or philosophy. Both, as it turned out. Chapter 3. The year he almost did not continue. In the winter of 1869 and into the spring of 1870, William James sank into a darkness that he would later call the worst period of his life. The symptoms were not dramatic in any external sense. He did not do anything violent or irreversible. He continued to read. He continued, fitfully, to write in his diary. He continued to attend to the small obligations of daily life. But inside the reading and the writing and the small obligations, there was a terror that had no specific object, a dread that attached itself to everything and was caused by nothing in particular. He described it later, in his book The Varieties of Religious Experience, in a section about what he called the sick soul. He told the story there as if it had happened to a French correspondent, a Frenchman who had sent him a description of his worst period. But the people who knew James well always suspected, and the scholars who came after him eventually confirmed that the Frenchman was James himself. The experience he described: entering a room in the evening and suddenly being overcome by the image of an epileptic patient he had seen in an asylum. The man had been a pale, greenish figure sitting in a corner, his knees drawn up to his chin, entirely reduced, entirely unreachable. And James, entering the room that evening, was suddenly that figure, felt himself to be, in some essential and undeniable way, the man in the corner. That level of reduction was possible. That level of emptiness was available to him. He knew this with the certainty of someone who had just been shown something true. What followed was months of anxiety so profound that, as he wrote, he could not go out after dark without a kind of terror. He had to sleep in his mother's room for several weeks. He was 27, he had a medical degree, he had read everything. He had a father who had been through something similar and had survived it. None of this helped much. What helps in these periods is rarely what should help. It is rarely the argument or the evidence or the credential. It is something smaller, something almost embarrassingly small. For William James, it was a sentence he read in the spring of 1870 inches, a book by the French philosopher Charles Renouvier. Renouvier defined free will as the sustaining of a thought because I choose to when I might have other thoughts. That was the definition. Not some grand metaphysical claim, not proof that determinism was wrong. Just, I can choose what to hold, and I can sustain it. James read this and felt something shift. Not a sudden transformation, not a cure, but a small, usable thing. He could not prove free will. He could not argue his way to it, but he could choose to believe in it. He could make that belief his first free act. He picked up his journal. He would come back to what he wrote there. Soon, not yet. Let your body stay where it is. Feel the surface beneath you, the weight of your own stillness. He did not know, writing in that journal, that he was inventing something. He thought he was trying to survive. But the two things, it turns out, are often the same. Chapter 4 to one entry in a diary. The 30th of April, 1870, Cambridge, Massachusetts. He had been working on his journal intermittently all winter. The entries from that period are not cheerful reading. They circle. They return to the same fears. They ask whether the project of being William James is one that can be sustained. And then, on the 30th of April, something changed in the tone. He wrote, "I think that yesterday was a crisis in my life. I finished the first part of Renouvilier's second Assize, and I see no reason why his definition of free will, the sustaining of a thought because I choose to when I might have other thoughts, need be the definition of an illusion. At any rate, I will assume for the present, until next year, that it is no illusion. My first act of free will shall be to believe in free will. That is the sentence. That is the entry. It is strange, when you read it now, how small it is. He did not find God. He did not discover a proof. He did not arrive at some position that would survive philosophical scrutiny for the ages. He made a practical choice. He said, I will act as if the thing is real. I will live inside the assumption. If it is a fiction, it is a useful fiction, and I am tired enough that I will take useful over true. What he did not know was that this was the beginning of a philosophy. Pragmatism, the idea that the truth of a belief is partly determined by what it does, by how it works in the world of lived experience, did not yet have that name. It would not have that name for decades. But the seed of it was right there in that journal entry on the last day of April in a room in Cambridge in 1870. He was not a happy man on that night. He was still exhausted. The terror had not entirely lifted. The back still ached. But something had been decided or chosen or declared. The difference between those three is one of the things James would spend the rest of his life working out. He lived for another 40 years. He built the first psychology laboratory in America in 1875 in a small room at Harvard. He wrote The Principles of Psychology, all 1,400 pages of it over 11 years, publishing it in 1890. He gave the Gifford Lectures in Edinburgh that became the Varieties of Religious Experience. He lectured on pragmatism in Boston and Berkeley and New York and was received by the 1890s and into the 1900s as something close to the most prominent philosopher in the English-speaking world. He also continued to be someone who suffered. The heart disease that would eventually kill him was diagnosed when he was in the Adirondack Mountains in 1898. Climbing Mount Marcy at night with a group of friends, reaching the summit as dawn arrived over the range, feeling a joy so complete and physical that it stays on the page when he describes it in a letter. He reached camp the next morning and found a telegram from his wife. Something was wrong with his heart. He lived 12 more years. That is the shape of a life. A journal entry in April, a laboratory in a small room, 1,400 pages over 11 years. The Adirondacks at dawn, the telegram. There is no clean arc to it. It does not resolve in the way a story is supposed to resolve. He remained, until the end, a man who was uncertain about most things that mattered, and certain only about the small, practical business of choosing to continue. That choice, he would argue, is not nothing. It may, in fact, be everything. The entry in the diary is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of a question about what happens when you choose to believe in the thing you cannot prove and then live as if you already had. We will return to this question. For now, let the breath move. Let the hands rest. Let the room do what it does in the late hours when nothing is required. Chapter 5. What consciousness actually is. In 1879, Wilhelm Wundt opened the first formal psychological laboratory in Leipzig, Germany. He believed that consciousness could be studied the way a chemist studies compounds. Break it down into its elements, isolate each element, measure its properties. This was called introspection in the scientific sense, trained observers watching their own mental processes and reporting back on what they found. James was skeptical from the beginning, not because introspection was wrong exactly, but because the model of consciousness as something that could be broken into elements seemed to him to miss something essential. He had spent enough time watching his own mind to know that it did not present itself as a collection of parts. It did not announce itself as a series of discrete sensations neatly separable. It presented itself as a flow, not a chain of links, not a series of frames. A flow, a continuous moving thing that was always partly what came before and always partly becoming what came after, and in which the edges were never clean. He was working on the principles of psychology through the 1880s, one of the longest and most difficult projects of his life. His publisher had commissioned it in 1878 for a 12-month delivery. He delivered it in 1890. It was 1,400 pages long. His publisher, slightly incredulous, published it anyway. In the chapter on the stream of thought, later renamed the stream of consciousness, James made an argument that has not dated. He said, "Consciousness is not a thing. It is not an object that can be found and examined the way a rock can be found and examined. It is a process, and the most important feature of that process is its continuity." He borrowed his vocabulary from water, not because water is particularly scientific, but because water is the thing that best captures what he was trying to describe. Think of the way a river does not have a beginning and an end in any single moment. Think of how the river of this instant already carries the river of a second ago within it. Think of how the next bend is already implicit in the current as it moves. That is what the mind is like, he argued. Not a collection of snapshots, a moving thing, continuous, with no sharp edges between one moment and the next. The secondary voices in the room that night, the philosophers who would have understood what James was reaching for, include Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic who held that you cannot step into the same river twice, and Henri Bergson, the French philosopher slightly younger than James, who was arriving at similar ideas about time and duration from a different direction. But James was getting here through direct observation. He was watching his own mind, and what he was watching was something that refused to be still. There is a word he used that matters. He called what he was studying the fringe, not the center. The center of any conscious moment is whatever we are focusing on right now. But around the center always is a fringe, a penumbra of meanings, associations, half-formed feelings, the echo of what was just thought, the shadow of what is about to be thought. The fringe is not nothing. The fringe is in many ways more interesting than the center. It is where mood lives. It is where the sense of something familiar, or the sense of something wrong, or the sense of almost but not quite remembering arrives before you can name it. James called this the sense of relation, the feeling of and if and but, not the nouns and verbs, but the connective tissue. He argued that the connective tissue was at least as much the mind as the clear objects it pauses on. This is not a small claim. If the fringe is real, if the continuous, relational, semi-conscious context of any moment of thinking is as real as the thought itself, then consciousness is not what Wundt thought it was. It is not a collection of data points. It is an atmosphere, and you live inside it the way you live inside the air. The thought you had an hour ago is still with you in the fringe. The argument from this morning is still with you. The question you have been asking for 30 years is still with you. Not as a problem, as part of the stream. Chapter 6. The stream and the banks. He called it a stream for a reason. A chain has discrete links. You can remove one link and the rest is still a chain. But a stream is not like that. Remove a section of a stream and you have not two streams and a gap. You have two streams that are no longer the stream they were. The water has changed. The current has changed. The thing is continuous, or it is nothing. James was making a case against atomism, the idea that the mind is made of atoms, mental atoms, sensations that combine according to rules the way physical atoms combine, was the dominant theory of his era. Wundt was an atomist. The British associationists before him had been atomists. The idea was clean and scientific and felt like progress. But James looked at his own experience and could not find the atoms. What he found was different. He found a movement. He found something that was always becoming something else, always tinged by what came before, always leaning toward what came next. He found in particular something he called the feeling of tendency, the sense in the middle of a thought of where it is going before it gets there. The way you can feel the end of a sentence before you have reached it. The way you can sense the shape of a resolution before the resolution arrives. This feeling of tendency is not nothing. It is, James argued, some of the most important data the mind has. The fringe, the half-conscious, semi-articulated, almost felt context of any moment is where we live most of the time. The stream metaphor does something important. It places you inside the thing rather than outside it looking at it. Wundt's observers were trying to stand outside consciousness and observe it. James was saying, you cannot do that. You cannot stand outside the stream to study the stream. because the very act of studying is part of the stream. The observer is not separate from what is observed. Think of the word but. He raises this example in the Principles of Psychology. The word but does not carry sensory content the way apple or red or hand carries content. It carries relation. It carries the feeling of what it is like to be reversing direction. When you hear but in the middle of a sentence, something happens in your mind that is not nothing. You brace slightly, you hold the previous content a little differently, you reorient, and that something is a real mental event. He called these transitive states, not the resting places of thought, but the movements between them. The stream moves. The rocks it flows around are the clear, stable objects of attention, the named things, the solid nouns. But most of what you experience in any moment is water, not rock, movement, not object. He never stopped being interested in what it meant to know something in this way. Philosophers before him and some after him treated knowledge as a static relation between a mind and an object. James wanted to know what the knowing felt like from the inside, what the movement was like, how it felt to have a thought you had not quite finished thinking yet. He was describing something that would not have a full name for another 100 years. The phenomenologists in Europe, Edmund Husserl in Germany, Maurice Merleau-Ponty in France, would spend decades working through similar territory from a different starting point. But James was there first, and he was there not as an abstract systematizer, but as a writer who had been paying very close attention to his own experience. You have been in the stream all day. The thoughts that came before the moment you lay down are still in it. The current has not stopped because your body has. There is something James understood about this that is not, on the surface, comforting. The stream does not stop. But, and this is where it gets interesting, it also does not need to. The stream does not need to be dammed to be restful. It can move more slowly. The banks can be quiet. The water can carry what it carries and still become a slower thing. That is what happens on the good nights, not absence of the stream, a slowing. There is something waiting for us later in this account. He called it the difference between the sick soul and the healthy soul, and he placed himself in the first category without hesitation. That is not where tonight ends, but we will carry it until we arrive there. Chapter 7, The Things That Flow Between. James had a gift for finding what everyone else had been walking past for years. One of the things he found in the streams and fringes of consciousness was what he called the sense of relations. Not just the large relations, the logical connections, the causal links, but the small ones, the relation between this thought and the next, the feeling of and, the feeling of then, the feeling of a long pause. He believed these relational states were undervalued to the point of invisibility in the psychology and philosophy of his time. Everyone was focused on the objects of consciousness, the sensations, the images, the concepts. Nobody was writing seriously about the spaces between the objects, the transitive states. The feeling of moving from one thought to another, which is so rapid and so continuous that we usually do not notice it is happening, except at night. At night, with the lights off and the body still, the transitive states become more visible. The spaces between thoughts slow down. The feeling of having a half-formed thought that has not yet arrived at its noun, the reaching, the not quite there, stretches out and becomes available to observation. James would have said, "Good." That is the stream revealing itself, not as a problem, as what it always was. He had a colleague at Harvard, the philosopher Josiah Royce, who was his intellectual opposite in temperament. Where James was loose and empirical and suspicious of systems, Royce was systematic and idealist and committed to building large architectures of thought. They disagreed about almost everything and liked each other enormously. Their arguments about consciousness and reality and loyalty and community ran for decades through correspondence and lectures and the particular productive friction of two very different minds sharing the same hallway. James needed that friction. He was not by nature a builder of systems, he was a noticer. He noticed what was there and then tried to describe it accurately and then moved on. His books do not close the questions they open. They widen them. He was also, throughout his career, someone who took seriously the experiences that respectable science had been too dismissive to examine. The Varieties of Religious Experience, the testimony of mystics, the sense of expanded consciousness that some people described in moments of crisis or grace. He did not endorse these as proof of anything supernatural. He insisted on examining them as data, as things that had happened to human beings and therefore mattered regardless of whether they fit the existing categories. He published The Varieties of Religious Experience in 1902. He was 60 years old. He had been teaching at Harvard for most of his adult life. He had written The Principles. He was famous in a way that philosophers rarely become famous, the kind of famous where people came to his lectures not because they were students, but because they had heard there was something worth listening to. He remained, through all of this, someone who found sleep difficult. That particular piece of irony, I think he would have appreciated. The stream continues. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. The night is doing its work. Chapter 8. A Room in Cambridge. Harvard gave William James an office. He almost never used the way offices are supposed to be used. He preferred to think while moving. He walked constantly around Cambridge, along the Charles River, through the parks near his house on Irving Street, where he lived with his wife Alice Howe, Gibbons, James, and their 5 children. The walk was not recreation, it was cognition. He thought best when his body was doing something, and the doing of something allowed the mind to work without watching itself too carefully. He and Alice had married in 1878, after what his biographers describe as a courtship conducted partly through letters and partly through William's characteristic mixture of intense engagement and last-minute terror. He had been afraid of marriage in the way he was afraid of most large commitments, not afraid of the thing itself, but afraid of the foreclosure. Choosing one thing meant not choosing another. And James, constitutionally, felt the weight of what was not chosen. Alice was steadier than he was. She ran the house with a competence he admired and sometimes envied. She bore the children, managed the correspondence, kept the domestic machinery of his life functioning with a smoothness that he rarely commented on and probably did not entirely understand. She also understood him, which is not as common as it should be between two people who live in the same house for 30 years. He talked about her sometimes in his letters as if slightly surprised that she had agreed to stay, as if the fact of being chosen regularly and without reservation was information he had trouble fully processing. The house on Irving Street in Cambridge, Massachusetts, was a New England house of the late Victorian period. Wooden, many-gabled, deep in trees in the summer and bare and cold in the winter. The study was on the upper floor, books everywhere, papers in the particular order of a person who cannot quite be called organized, but can remember where everything is. He received visitors at the house and at his office, and people sought him out. Not just students, though there were always students, other writers, other thinkers. The historian Henry Adams came. Gertrude Stein was one of his students at Radcliffe and told the story, later, of turning in an examination blue book with nothing inside but a note explaining that she did not feel like having an examination that day, and leaving. He apparently responded by giving her the highest grade in the course. He was, by most accounts, one of the great teachers. Not because he was orderly or systematic or because he tested his students in rigorous ways, but because he made them feel that what they were thinking mattered, that the thing they had noticed, the small, uncomfortable observation that did not quite fit the categories, was worth following. He gave his students the sense that the universe was an interesting place and that they were entitled to be curious about it. This is not nothing. Some teachers give you information. James gave his students permission. He suffered during all of this from what he called his variety of insanity, periods of high anxiety, low energy, the sense that the mechanism was not running properly. He treated these with cures of the era, rest cures, European travel, cold water treatments that were the fashion of the late 19th century and can only be described as vigorous misery dressed up as medicine. Some helped, most did not. What helped, in the end, was the same thing that had helped in 1870. Writing, thinking, finding the precise word for the imprecise thing, turning the experience itself into an object of study. He was too honest to pretend the darkness was not there. He was too curious to let it be only darkness. He made it interesting, not in a trivializing way, in the way that a committed observer makes everything interesting, by refusing to look away until he had understood something true about it. Chapter 9, Habit, the Great Wheel of Society. If your mind has been somewhere else, come back gently. We are still here, in the company of William James. Of all the chapters in the Principles of Psychology, the one on habit has lasted best. James published the Principles in 1890, and the habit chapter was already famous before the book was even complete. He had given a version of it as a lecture, and people had remembered it, quoted it, argued with it, and returned to it in ways that suggested it was touching something real. What he argued, in essence, was this: habit is the mechanism by which the mind, over time, hands its most frequently repeated actions over to the body. When you first learn to ride a bicycle, you have to think about it. Every adjustment, every turn, every act of balance requires conscious attention. But with practice, the bicycle riding moves downward, out of the realm of effortful thought and into something more automatic. The body learns it, the mind is freed. This is the machinery James called habit, and he argued that this machinery was not merely convenient, it was the structural basis of a stable society and of a stable self. His phrase, "Habit is the great flywheel of society, its most precious conservative agent." He meant that the enormous amount of energy civilization requires is only sustainable because most of what we do is automatic. If we had to consciously decide every morning how to get dressed, how to walk, how to speak, we would exhaust ourselves before breakfast. Habit is what makes the most fundamental tasks invisible so that the rarer, more demanding tasks can receive attention. This is, on the surface, a comforting idea. The machinery runs, the conscious mind is freed for higher purposes. But James was honest about the shadow side. The shadow side is that habit forms before you understand what it is forming. You are not yet old enough to choose when the earliest habits take hold. The child learns the rhythms of its household, the emotional weather, the way conflict is handled or avoided, the relationship between effort and reward, and encodes these rhythms as habits before it has the language to question them. By the time the language arrives, the habits are already running. He had a phrase for this that lives in the chest when you first read it. We are spinning our own fates, good or evil, and never to be undone. He was not a fatalist. The sentence continues, the key word is never to be undone, because James believed the habits could be changed with effort and with time and with the right kind of attention. But he was clear that they would not change on their own. They required deliberate work. And the earlier the work was done, the easier it was. There is something here about what you are carrying tonight. The loop that keeps running in your mind before sleep may not be a thought you chose. It may be a pattern laid down a long time ago, the particular way anxiety presents itself in your family, or the way your nervous system learned to stay alert past the time when alertness is useful, or the reflex of reviewing the day as if it were a performance evaluation. None of this is your fault in the original sense, but it is yours to work with. James would say the habit can be changed, not easily, not immediately, but deliberately, with the right practice, with the consistent small choices made in the moments when choice is available. He was insistent on the small choice. The large resolution, I will be different from now on, rarely works in his view, because the large resolution is made in a moment of high intention that the habit will outlast. The small practice, repeated at the right moment, is what eventually changes the deeper groove. He was describing in 1890 something that later research into behavior change would confirm in considerable detail. The pattern is not fixed. The groove in the riverbank can be widened elsewhere. The water will eventually follow the new course, but you have to cut the new course first. Let your shoulders drop. Notice the surface beneath you. The room does not require anything of you tonight. We go on. Chapter 10, The Ruts We Do Not Choose. There is a kind of tiredness that comes not from having worked hard, but from having moved all day through channels that feel slightly wrong. You are competent in them. You have been moving through them for years. But somewhere underneath the competence is the awareness that these channels were not exactly chosen, they were arrived at through a series of smaller adjustments that made sense at the time, and now they are simply the shape of things. William James called these ruts, not as an insult, as an observation. He was interested in how the channels of habit form before the self is old enough to participate in their formation, and how, once formed, they exert a pressure that is very difficult to distinguish from preference. The person who grew up in a household where emotions were handled through withdrawal now withdraws when overwhelmed and calls it their nature. The person whose early experiences of effort were rewarded irregularly now approaches uncertainty with anxiety and calls it who they are. In both cases, the habit came first. The identity story came second. But the story was so convincing that the sequence was reversed and the habit became invisible inside the nature. This is the specific weight James was describing. He was not, at this stage in his thinking, a determinist. He would later insist and insist again on the reality of free will. He had staked his recovery on it. But his honesty about habit was the other side of that coin. The will is real, he believed, but it operates within grooves, and the grooves are older than the will. The most sobering passage in the habit chapter of the Principles is the one about age. James wrote that by 30, and he may have underestimated, or he may have been right in ways we have collectively preferred not to hear. The character has set like plaster and will soften no more. He did not mean this as condemnation, he meant it as urgency. He was writing, in part, to young people, and the message was, the window is now. The habits that will run your life for decades are forming today. The question is whether you are forming them deliberately or whether you are simply falling into the shape of least resistance. The phrase, set like plaster, is a hard one to sit with. It sounds final. It sounds like the end of possibility. But James, being James, immediately turned the screw the other way. If the character sets, then what we do before it sets matters enormously. The small daily practice, the choice, made again and again at the moment when the choice presents itself, is not just habit formation, it is self-construction. You are building something that will run without you. The question is whether what runs without you is what you would have chosen if you had understood the stakes. Tonight, in the quiet after everything, this is worth a moment. Not as self-criticism. The ruts you did not choose were formed by someone who was young and working with what they had. The question for now is not why they formed, but whether in the moments when you have attention, you are choosing the next small groove. James believed you could. He had done it himself. The diaries of 1869 and 1870 document a man so deeply in the rut of despair that nothing else was visible. And then, beginning with one entry, one act of will toward belief in something better, the groove slowly began to shift. It was not dramatic, it was not immediate, but it was real. Let that settle for a moment. The room holds you where you are. Chapter 11, How a Life Becomes Its Own Pattern. There is a thing that happens in lives that James noticed and described with unusual precision. A life begins to organize itself around its own recurring choices, until the choices and the life become indistinguishable. He was not making a mystical claim. He was making an empirical one, rooted in his understanding of how the nervous system accumulates and stores behavior. Every time you make a choice, the pathway that choice traveled becomes slightly more available the next time a similar situation arrives. The neurology of this was not fully understood in James's era. The language of synaptic connections and neural pathways would come later, but James had the phenomenological description exactly right. You become what you repeatedly do, not what you intend to do, not what you believe yourself to be doing in your best moments, but what you actually repeatedly do. This is both terrifying and clarifying. It is terrifying because so much of what we repeatedly do is not chosen. It happened through momentum, through the pull of the familiar, through the way a life once going in a particular direction generates its own gravity. The person who has spent 10 years in a kind of half-present inattention to those they love will find, at the end of that 10 years, that inattention has become their relational mode. It was never what they would have said they wanted. It was simply what happened, one distracted day at a time. James documented the same mechanism in his own life with unusual candor. He was aware that he had patterns of procrastination, of self-doubt, of intellectual enthusiasm that sometimes shaded into diffusion, and he traced them with the curiosity of a naturalist examining a specimen he happened to also be living inside of. The self-examination was not cruel. It was precise. He believed that the pattern could be changed, but he was careful about how. He did not believe in sudden reversals, in the drama of total transformation. He believed in the insertion of new choices at the key moment, the moment of temptation back to the old groove, the moment of tiredness when the easier path presents itself, the moment when the old feeling arrives and the new response has to be chosen again, still again. The life does not become its own pattern all at once. It becomes it one unremarkable day at a time. This is, in a sense, humbling. The great changes we imagine, the future selves who have it together, who have learned to rest, who no longer carry the low-grade anxiety of a mind that never fully stops, those selves are not arrived at by the grand gesture. They are arrived at by the small daily practice, maintained past the point where it feels meaningful, past the point where progress is visible, into the territory where the new groove is deep enough to carry the water on its own. James used the word automaticity. The goal of the deliberate practice is to make the better behavior automatic, not effortful forever, automatic, so that the nervous system runs the new pattern the way it currently runs the old one. This is a long game. It requires patience he did not always have, and later came to cultivate. You are in the long game tonight. The fact that you are here at this hour, choosing rest, choosing deliberately the practice of stillness, is itself a small groove, made again, deepened slightly. That is enough. We continue. The philosopher Derek Parfit, writing nearly a century after James, would return to this problem under a different name. He was interested in what constituted personal identity over time, what made the person you are now the same person as the child who first formed those early grooves. His conclusion was that identity was less fixed than we assumed, more a matter of overlapping connections than of a continuous essential self. James would have recognized the intuition, though he came at it from a different direction. What both men were pointing toward was a kind of moral consequence. If the patterns were not fully chosen, if they were laid down before the chooser was fully formed, then the appropriate response is not guilt but curiosity. Not the backward-looking question of why this became the pattern, but the forward-looking question of what the pattern is and where it can, with deliberate effort, be redirected. James believed the redirection was always possible and always the work of the present moment, not the grand resolution, the small choice made now and then again. Chapter 12. The attention that is not given. James wrote more carefully about attention than almost any psychologist before him, and his central claim was deceptively simple. Attention is not what you have, it is what you do. He meant something precise by this. The common experience of attention is passive. Something arrives in our awareness and captures us, whether we want it to or not. The thought that snags, the memory that resurfaces at the wrong hour, the worry that pulls the mind from what it was doing to rehearse a scenario that may never occur. This kind of attention arrives unbidden and lodges itself, and the person who experiences it has the feeling of being a passenger rather than a driver. James was not denying this experience. He had it himself. He documented it in the crisis years, when his mind would move, without his permission, into the territory of bleakest thought and remain there in ways that felt impossible to interrupt. But he distinguished this passive, captured attention from what he called voluntary attention, the deliberate act of holding the mind's focus on something it would not naturally stay with. And he argued that voluntary attention was the most important psychological capacity a person could develop, because it was the capacity through which everything else became possible. Emerson had written that the secret of education lies in respecting the pupil. James translated this into cognitive terms. The secret of self-development lies in directing attention. The person who can attend who can hold their focus on what they have chosen to attend to, past the point where other things begin pulling, is the person who can learn, grow, change, create, and maintain the kind of presence in their own life that constitutes something close to freedom. He was not describing a natural gift, he was describing a skill. And skills, by definition, are developed through practice. He wrote at one point that the faculty of voluntarily bringing back the wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. An education which would improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. But it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical directions for bringing it about. This last sentence is characteristic James. He could identify the thing with great precision and then turn honestly to the difficulty of getting there, without pretending the map was the territory. Tonight, your attention has been pulled by a long day. It has been directed, redirected, interrupted, demanded of, divided. The mind in this state does not rest easily. It continues its movements, replaying, projecting, turning over the same materials that it was given during the hours when it could not stop. What James would offer at this hour is not an instruction, it is an observation. The attention can be placed, not forced. Placed gently on something quieter, the sound of the room. The feeling of weight against whatever surface holds you. The breath moving in the dark. You do not have to stop the other thoughts. You only have to notice when the attention has drifted and place it gently again. This is the practice. Simple and repetitive and, with time, deepening. James had a word for the failure of voluntary attention that he found especially precise: automatism. When the mind is on automatic, running the familiar pathways, rehearsing the familiar material, replaying what has already been replayed 100 times, it is not exactly present to anything. It is doing what habits do, running without requiring the conscious self to drive. The voluntary return, the act of noticing that the automatism has taken over and placing the attention somewhere chosen, was, in James's view, the central act of a conscious life. Not because automatism was always wrong. The habit chapters had been clear that automatism was often essential and good, but because there were moments when the automatic deserved to be interrupted. When what the moment contained was not being received because the mind was elsewhere. This hour, this night, this exact quality of stillness available right now, these are not things the automatic mind registers. They require a voluntary act, small, gentle. The placing of attention on what is actually here rather than on what the mind has carried in from elsewhere. You have been doing this for some time now. The practice is already happening. Chapter 13. What we are really paying for. There is something James understood about cost that is different from the usual accounting. The usual accounting of the mind counts what has been taken from us. The hours that were spent on things that did not matter. The energy given to conflicts that resolve nothing. The attention absorbed by the small frictions of the day that do not, in retrospect, warrant what they received. This accounting is accurate as far as it goes, but it tends to produce regret, which is a particularly exhausting form of continued expenditure. James had a different ledger. He was interested in what attention costs in the present tense, not as a reason for regret, but as information for choice. What are you paying for right now in units of attention? The scrolling that produces nothing but the mild anesthetic of new images. The loop of re-examination running beneath the surface of whatever else you are doing. The anticipatory attention given to events that have not yet happened and may not, consuming the present in service of a future that keeps receding. He called this the problem of overinvestment, not in the financial sense, in the attentional sense. The person who pays more attention to an experience than the experience warrants is not being careful. They are misallocating. And because attention is finite, because the mind has only so much available for voluntary direction before it exhausts itself, the misallocation has a real cost. This is not a comfortable framing, because it places responsibility inside the person doing the paying rather than with the thing demanding payment. And it is true that some things demand more than they warrant, and there is genuine difficulty in refusing them. The worry that arrives at 2 a.m. with convincing urgency does not yield easily to the observation that it will look different in morning light. But James believed the observation was still worth making, not in the moment of maximum demand, when the anxious thought has full possession of the attention, but in the quieter moments, like this one, where the information can be received without the urgency distorting it. What are you paying for tonight? The question is not aggressive, it is curious. It is an invitation to notice the difference between attention given to what is actually here, the room, the dark, the breath, the weight of the body settling, and attention given to the simulacrum of other times and places that the mind constructs and inhabits as if they were real. The room is real. This moment is real. The breath moving through you is real. Everything else the mind is holding right now is a representation. Useful sometimes, but not requiring payment at this hour. James would say, you can withdraw the attention, not by force, by gentle redirection, by noticing and placing. And what is saved by the withdrawal is available for rest. Simone Weil, who came after James by decades and across a different tradition, put the same insight in terms that are, if anything, even starker. Attention, she wrote, is the rarest and purest form of generosity. What she meant was that truly attending to something, giving it the fullness of your presence, without the backroom noise of your own concerns running simultaneously, was an act so rare as to constitute a kind of gift. James would have recognized this. His theory of attention was grounded in observation, not in mysticism, but the observation was of the same territory Weil was pointing toward. The way genuine attention is different in kind from the half-presence most experience provides. The difference between being in the room and actually being there. At this hour, the most generous thing available is attention directed toward the present moment, the room, the quiet, the body settling. Nothing else requires it. Nothing else is asking for it. The withdrawal that James was describing, the gentle refusal to keep paying attention to things that have no claim on this particular moment, is available right now and costs nothing at all. Chapter 14, The Self and its Three Layers. James divided the self into three regions, and the division has stayed useful for 130 years because it corresponds to something people recognize when they encounter it. The first region he called the material self, the body, its extensions, its possessions, its immediate environment. The people who belong to us, our family, our close relations, he placed here too in the material self, because we experience threats to them as threats to ourselves, and their losses as our own. This is the self of physical sensation, of hunger and warmth, and the particular weight of a familiar body in a familiar room. The second region he called the social self. Not one social self, but many. James was careful about this. He wrote that a man has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize him, by which he meant the version of you that exists in the perception of your oldest friend is a different self from the version that exists in the perception of a colleague, which is a different self from the version that exists in the perception of an acquaintance met once at a gathering. You carry many selves, and you move between them, often in a single day, with a fluency that is remarkable if you stop to notice it. The third region he called the spiritual self, and here his terminology is slightly misleading if you expect something mystical. What he meant was the sense of self as a knower, as the thing doing the experiencing, as the subjective center around which everything else is organized. He would later spend years trying to describe this with considerable difficulty, because it was the most elusive of the three, the self that notices all the other selves but cannot quite be located. He had a phrase for this deep core: the self of selves. The most stable, most central, most familiar I, the one that has been continuous through all the changes of childhood and age, through all the different social selves and material circumstances, through illness and health and the decade-long shifts in what one believes and values. That thread of continuity, whatever it is, wherever it lives, was what James was pointing at. Tonight, at this hour, most of the social selves have gone quiet. The version of you that exists in the workplace, the version that performs competence or warmth or calm or confidence, those are resting. The material self is in contact with what holds it. The spiritual self, the deep knower, is here and quietly present. This is one of the gifts of late-night stillness that James never quite named directly, but gestured toward in his later work, the simplification that comes when the social performances are suspended. The quiet where you can hear something closer to what you actually are, underneath all the versions. Rest in that for a moment. Let the social selves recede. There is only this room, this breath, this continuity. James spent considerable time in the Principles working through what he called the rivalry of the selves, the way the different social selves compete for priority, the way the material self and the spiritual self can pull in opposite directions, the way a life can feel fractured across its different domains. He did not have a solution to this rivalry in the conventional sense. He did not argue that the cells could be unified into a seamless whole. He argued more modestly that they could be held together with sufficient awareness of how they operated. The person who knows they have a social self and knows that the social self is a performance calibrated to a specific audience is in a better position than the person who simply is the performance without knowing it. The knowing creates a small but crucial distance. It permits a kind of interior mobility that the unreflective person cannot access. Tonight, the different selves have quieted in their competition. The social performances have concluded. The material self is at rest. What persists is the quiet witness, whatever is actually doing the experiencing in this moment, whatever has been continuous through the entire day, through the years, through the changing circumstances. James called it the spiritual self. You do not need to name it. It is simply here, doing what it has always done. Chapter 15. The social self at midnight. The social self is a performer, and like all performers, it is exhausted by evening. James understood the social self as fundamentally reactive. It forms in response to others, is maintained for others, is validated or threatened by others, and requires the presence of others, at least in imagination, to function. Which means that the social self is always, in some sense, on. Even in the absence of other people, the mind continues its social performance, rehearsing future encounters, reviewing past ones, adjusting the inner narrative of who one is in relation to a world that contains other selves who are watching and judging. This is useful during the day. The social self is what allows us to navigate the enormous complexity of being a person among persons, to modulate tone and register and degree of disclosure, to recognize what a situation calls for and provide it, to be different things in different company without fragmenting. But at midnight, the social self needs to stop. James did not use this language exactly, but the logic is in his work, and the researchers who came after him have made it explicit. The default mode network, the neuroscience term for the brain's resting state activity, is largely a social simulation machine. When we are not actively engaged in a task, the mind tends to run models of other people, what they think, what they feel, what they might do, how they might respond to us. This is the substrate of the social self's ongoing operation, and it does not stop just because the day has ended. It takes something to stop it. Often, the body's exhaustion does some of the work. But there is a residue that persists even past tiredness. The social mind running its simulations in the background, the re-examination of what was said and how it landed, the anticipatory modeling of tomorrow's encounters with their possible difficulties. James would recognize this as the social self working overtime, not maliciously, not stupidly, simply doing what it is structured to do, past the moment when its work is useful. The instruction, if there is one, is gentle. The people the social self is running simulations about are not here. They are in their own evenings, their own midnights, their own rest or restlessness. They do not require you to model them tonight. They will be available tomorrow in their actual presence, and the modeling can resume then. For now, the social self can be set down. What remains when the social self rests is something quieter and less reactive. James noted in the Principles that the social self was the most volatile of the three, the most susceptible to damage, the most easily wounded, the most dependent on the continuing validation of others to maintain its stability. The material self required only physical care. The spiritual self required only honest attention. But the social self required other people, and other people were, in James's view, the most unpredictable element in any human life. This volatility was part of why he thought the social self should never be allowed to become the whole self. The person who had no interior life beyond the social performances, who existed only in the eyes of others, who had no room behind the room, was peculiarly fragile. Any rupture in social relation, any loss of status, any encounter with the irreversibility of time could destabilize them entirely. The room behind the room, a phrase Montaigne used for the interior space he maintained through all his public life, was James's version of the same thing, not a retreat from the world. A place from which to engage it without being entirely at its mercy. That room is available now. You are in it. Nothing from outside is required or welcome tonight. Something closer to the spiritual self James described, the simple witness, aware, continuing, at rest behind the performance. Let it rest. The room asks nothing of you that requires performance. We move gently forward. Chapter 16. When reputation becomes a room you cannot leave. James had a specific anxiety that shows up in his correspondence and his later memoir accounts, and it is one that many people recognize in themselves at midnight: the anxiety about what one appears to be. Not what one is, what one appears to be. He was a famous man for much of his adult life, famous in the way academics can be famous, which is modest by most measures, but still enough to create the weight of a public image. He was Professor James. He was the author of the Principles. He was the lecturer whose style was beloved, whose classes filled, whose ideas were circulated. And he was aware, with some discomfort, that this image was both real and not real, that the man who got tired and depressed and uncertain was also the man who was supposed to represent a vigorous and generous philosophy. His later work, particularly in A Pluralistic Universe, has a quality of deliberate self-exposure, as if he were trying to crack the portrait before it hardened entirely. He is uncertain in those pages. He is working. He is not performing wisdom, but actively pursuing it, and the pursuing is sometimes awkward and sometimes confused. He chose this. It was, in some sense, his answer to the problem of reputation. Do the work visibly, including the uncertain parts. Let the image crack on its own. But the anxiety he was managing is not unique to the famous. Most people live with some version of it. The reputation that has formed in the minds of those around you, colleague, friend, family member, partner, is a room of sorts. It has a particular shape. Others have arranged it according to their perceptions, and you are expected to inhabit it. And sometimes the room no longer fits. Sometimes you have changed in ways the reputation has not registered, or you have not changed in ways the reputation insists you have, and either way there is a gap between who the room says you are and what you actually carry. James's response to this, distilled through many texts and many years, was something like, "The reputation is theirs. What you are is yours." The work of living is to bring the latter closer to what you actually value, not to perform the former more convincingly. This is easier to write than to live. The room of reputation exerts real pressure. Other people's perceptions have practical consequences. James knew this. But at midnight, the room is temporarily empty. No one is watching. No one requires the performance. And in that temporary emptiness, it is possible to set down the image for a moment and rest in something closer to what is actually true. What is actually true for you tonight is simpler than the room's furniture suggests. A body at rest, a mind moving toward quiet, a self that is prior to and larger than what anyone thinks of it. Henry James, William's younger brother, the novelist, wrote in a late letter that it was the imagination of other people's attitudes toward us that was the most enslaving thing. He was describing characters in his fiction, but he was describing something he had observed in life, including in his famous brother's life. The older James was not immune to the imagination of others' attitudes. He wrote letters defending his views, wrote letters clarifying misunderstandings, wrote letters to people who had misread him, with a frequency that suggested the misreadings were not something he found easy to release. But he also wrote in the Varieties about the relief available in what he called the state of mind, where the ordinary sense of personal identity is in abeyance. Not in the mystical sense only, though that was the clearest version of it, but in the quieter ordinary sense of the hours when the social pressure lifts. He valued those hours. He sought them in nature, in walks, in the mountains, in the long evenings at home when nothing was required. This is one of those hours. The reputation sits in its room and you are somewhere else, somewhere prior, somewhere that does not require a reputation to be itself. That is enough. That is, in fact, a great deal. Chapter 17. The body that remembers before you do. James made a claim about emotion that was so counterintuitive when it appeared that it generated immediate controversy, was refined and debated for decades, and has now been substantially vindicated by the neuroscience of the 21st century. The claim, stated baldly, is this: we do not run from the bear because we are afraid. We are afraid because we run. He meant it literally. The emotion, the subjective experience of fear or grief or joy comes after the body has already begun responding. The heart rate changes, the muscles tense, the breath quickens, the blood moves, and these physical changes, perceived by the brain, constitute the emotion. The mind does not generate the feeling and then send it to the body. The body generates the response, and the mind reads it as feeling. This was received as deeply strange in 1884 when James first published it. The common-sense view that feelings cause physical reactions seemed obviously right. You feel sad and then you cry. James said, no. You cry, and the crying is what sadness is. He was not fully right in every particular. The theory has been refined many times over by figures including Walter Cannon, who argued that the thalamus plays a more central role than James suggested, and by Antonio Damasio a century later, whose somatic marker hypothesis is in some ways a sophisticated descendant of James's original claim. But the core intuition that the body's response is constitutive of emotion rather than merely expressive of it has held up. What does this mean for tonight? It means that the physical state of the body is not merely accompanying what you feel. It is part of what you feel. The tension in the shoulders is not just a symptom of the day's accumulated stress. The tension is some portion of the stress itself, carried forward by a body that processes experience more slowly than the mind does. James would not have been surprised by the concept of body memory. The way the organism carries the weight of difficult experience in specific physical locations, in habitual postures, in the particular tightness of a jaw or the set of a neck. He was pointing toward exactly this. The body remembers. The body is the ledger in which experience is actually recorded. And if the body is the ledger, then what the body needs at this hour is not more processing, it needs permission to set down the ledger. Bessel van der Kolk, working more than a century after James, would document in considerable clinical detail what James had observed from introspection, that the body stores experience at a level below voluntary recall, and that recovery requires engaging the body as a participant rather than treating it as an object to be managed. The insight is James's insight, made more precise by neuroscience and a century of clinical observation. What both men were pointing toward was the same thing, from different directions. The body has its own intelligence, its own timing, its own process of completion. When it is given the conditions it needs, the stillness, the warmth, the absence of demand, it will do what it knows how to do. It will process, it will release, it will restore. The conditions are available tonight. The body knows what to do with them. Notice the weight where you rest. The specific points of contact between the body and what holds it. Let the body be what it is, not a vehicle to be driven somewhere, not a problem to be solved, but the living thing you are, at rest in the dark. James would call this receiving the intelligence of the body. It runs deeper than thought. Notice the weight now. The places where the day is still being held. You do not have to release them all at once. Simply notice. James understood the body as an ally, not an obstacle. The same machinery that records difficulty can, when allowed, release it. Slowly, without drama. The night provides the conditions. The rest will come. Chapter 18. Emotion and the blood that moves first. James lived in his body in a way that was unusual for a philosopher of his era. He walked, he traveled, he spent weeks in the Adirondacks, hiking in conditions that were physically demanding, and he wrote about those experiences with a specificity of sensation that suggested genuine attention to what the body was doing and feeling. He was not, like many Victorian intellectuals, a man who related to his body primarily as a vehicle for the brain. He was interested in the whole organism. This interest shaped his psychology profoundly. When he turned to the question of emotion in 1884, in the paper "What is an Emotion?", he was drawing on a lifelong attention to his own physical states and what they were telling him. The theory he proposed was not abstract. It was rooted in observation. And the observation was, emotions live in the body before they live anywhere else. He invited readers to do a thought experiment. Imagine, he said, some strong emotion, grief, fear, rage, and then try to abstract from the consciousness of it all the feelings of the bodily symptoms. What remains? He believed and argued at length that what remains is very little. The feeling of the grief is the tearfulness, the tightening of the throat, the weight in the chest, the particular way the body wants to fold inward. Remove all of that and you have a pale cognitive judgment. This situation has involved loss, but not the emotion itself. The emotion is the body's response, perceived. John Dewey, who was in many ways James's most important intellectual heir, would later extend this into a broader theory of experience. All of our contact with the world is bodily before it is conceptual. We feel before we think, not as a failure of rationality, but as the condition of all perception. This lineage runs forward into the 20th century, into the phenomenology of Merleau-Ponty, who argued that the body is not something we have, but something we are, and into the more recent work of researchers who have mapped the ways that emotional memory and physical memory are stored in overlapping systems. James had the beginning of all of this in 1884, from a combination of introspection, medical training, and the particular quality of attention he brought to his own suffering. Tonight, the blood has moved all day in service of whatever the day required. The body has been registering moment by moment, the texture of experience, the small tensions of uncertain conversations, the particular depletion that comes after sustained performance, the residue of ordinary difficulty. All of that is still present in the body as the blood slows and the night begins. James would say, "Let the body do what it knows how to do now. The processing happened, the experiencing happened. What remains is the returning." Merleau-Ponty, who built his entire philosophy on the primacy of the body's experience over the mind's abstraction, wrote that the body is the place where we contact the world before the thinking begins. Not a vehicle carrying a mind, but the site of all experience, the primary intelligence through which everything else is organized. James had pointed toward this in 1884. Merleau-Ponty arrived at it from a different direction 40 years after James's death. Between them, they were describing the same thing. The body knows before the mind knows. The body receives before the mind categorizes. and the body releases before the mind has finished its analysis. You are returning. Slowly, with the night's help, the blood settles. The emotion that was the body's response to a long day softens back into simply a body at rest in the dark. That is enough for tonight. Chapter 19. The Sick Soul and the Healthy Soul. In the Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902, delivered first as lectures at Edinburgh, in the Gifford series on natural religion, James divided the human response to existence into two broad temperaments. He was not making a moral judgment. He was making a phenomenological observation drawn from hundreds of case studies, memoirs, conversion accounts, and first-person religious documents. The first temperament he called the healthy-minded. These are the people for whom the world appears, when they are in their native register, as fundamentally good. Not naive, not unintelligent. But their orientation is toward affirmation, toward the life in things, the meaning in events, the generosity of ordinary existence. Emerson, in James's account, was this kind of person. Whitman was. They can absorb difficulty without it displacing the underlying orientation. The world holds them even when parts of it resist. The second temperament he called the sick soul. The term is careful and contains no contempt. These are the people for whom the darkness is not an aberration, but a permanent member of the picture. The world contains real suffering, real absurdity, real failure of meaning, and the sick soul cannot look away from this. The healthy-minded person, in the sick soul's view, is achieving their serenity by selective omission, by leaving parts of the picture out. James placed himself, with characteristic honesty, in the sick soul category. The sick soul requires a more complete salvation, he wrote. It cannot be cured by the optimist's prescription of looking on the bright side, because the shadows that fall across its landscape are real, and it knows it. The happiness of the healthy-minded, available from within their own constitution, is genuinely not available to the sick soul through the same route. Something more is required. Something that passes through the darkness rather than around it. This is in part an account of his own crisis years, the years when he could not sleep without fear, could not look at a green-faced epileptic patient without seeing himself, could not draw on any reserve of natural confidence, because the reserve was simply not there. But it is also an account of a path. James was describing not only the affliction, but the spiritual opening that the affliction can produce. The sick soul who passes through its suffering, not around it, but through, emerges with a knowledge the healthy-minded person does not have and cannot acquire from the outside. A twice-born knowledge, James called it, the knowledge of someone who has been in the dark and come back. He was not prescribing suffering. He was observing that some kinds of depth require a certain kind of descent, and that the descent, survived, produces a person who is not frightened by the dark in the same way anymore, because they have been there and know it as a country, not only as a threat. We will return to what this means for you in a little while. Hold the two temperaments for now, the healthy-minded, the sick soul. and the quiet question of which register you are in tonight and what that knowledge offers. James was careful to say that the register could vary, that the same person might occupy different positions at different times, that illness or loss or exhaustion could move a naturally healthy-minded person into the sick soul's territory temporarily, and that recovery could move the sick soul toward a hard-won version of the healthy-minded's ease. The temperaments were not fixed chambers, but tendencies, inclinations, default positions that could be departed from. What he was most insistent about was the validity of both. The culture around him, the culture of his father's optimistic theology, of Emerson's cosmic affirmation, tended to treat the sick soul's view as a failure of trust, a deficit of faith, a problem to be corrected. James refused this. The sick soul's knowledge of darkness was real knowledge. It corresponded to something real in the universe. The twice-born person who had passed through the dark was not inferior to the once-born person who had never needed to. They were in possession of a different kind of knowledge, earned at a different price. The question of which register you inhabit tonight is not a diagnosis. It is an orientation, a way of knowing where you are in the landscape, so that you can receive what the landscape actually offers, rather than what you think it should. Whatever the landscape tonight, it contains rest. That is available regardless of temperament. Chapter 20. What religion actually does for the mind at night. James was not, in any conventional sense, a religious man. He did not belong to a church, did not adhere to a creed, was deeply skeptical of institutional religion and the claims it made about cosmology and history. His father, Henry James Sr., had been a Swedenborgian mystic of considerable eccentricity, and the atmosphere of James's childhood had been saturated with theological speculation without doctrinal fixing. He emerged from that atmosphere without a creed, but with something perhaps more unusual, a genuine curiosity about religious experience that was neither credulous nor dismissive. The Varieties of Religious Experience is the record of that curiosity. He was interested not in theology, but in function, not in what religion claimed to be true about the structure of the universe, but in what happened to a person who had a genuine religious experience. What did they feel? How did it change them? Was the change real? And how could you tell? His method was empirical. He gathered hundreds of first-person accounts, conversion experiences, mystical states, experiences of divine presence, experiences of the dissolution of the self, experiences of profound peace arriving in the middle of suffering. He read them without judgment, with the same careful attention he had given to his accounts of habit and emotion, looking for the pattern underneath the varying theological content. What he found was a recurrent structure. Across traditions, across centuries, across the enormous diversity of religious forms, a person carries a burden of sin, of inadequacy, of existential meaninglessness, of the inability to change what needs to change. They reach a point where the effort to carry the burden by themselves is exhausted. They let go, sometimes deliberately, sometimes in a moment of total defeat. And something shifts. The burden is lifted, not because the outer circumstances have changed, but because the inner relationship to the burden has changed. He called this the dynamic of surrender, and he was careful to say that the religious content, the specific theology, the specific figure surrendered to, was less important than the structure itself. What mattered was the releasing of the relentless grip of the self-managing ego on a problem it could not, by self-management alone, solve. This is not nothing, even for those who find traditional religion unavailable. What James identified was a psychological reality underneath the theological clothing. The relief that comes from genuinely accepting that something cannot be controlled, solved, or fixed by effort, and that the cessation of effort is not defeat, but a particular form of sanity. Tonight, this is its own small practice. The mind has been carrying the day. The effort to manage, solve, and control continued until a few hours ago. What would it mean now to set that effort down? Not to surrender to hopelessness, not to abandon what matters, but to release the grip on the night, on the silence, on the thing that simply needs to be slept through. James would recognize that as a small version of the thing he spent his later years studying. A small, ordinary, nightly version. Let the grip soften. The night holds you without asking for management in return. Augustine, writing his Confessions in the late 4th century, described the years before his conversion as years of frantic motion, seeking rest in everything that could not provide it, arriving at each new thing with expectation and finding each thing insufficient. The restlessness was the content of those years, not sinfulness exactly, the wrong direction for the seeking. James had read Augustine carefully, and the Confessions appear in the Varieties as one of the central case studies in the sick soul's trajectory. He was interested in the quality of the arrival Augustine described, not the theological content, but the experiential structure, the exhaustion of the frantic seeking. The discovery that the rest had been available all along in a different kind of direction. He translated this into a psychological observation. The anxious effort to secure what one needs by force, by managing, controlling, achieving, acquiring, is often the precise mechanism that makes what one needs unavailable. Rest is not achieved by trying harder to rest. Presence is not achieved by forcing oneself to be present. There is a kind of release that is the precondition for what the effort was seeking. The night is offering that release now. It has been here all along, waiting for the trying to soften. Chapter 21, The Will to Believe. The lecture was delivered in 1896, 4 years before the Edinburgh series, and it was controversial then and remains so now. James called it the will to believe, and his critics, including his friend and sometime philosophical sparring partner Bertrand Russell, thought it was an intellectual license for wishful thinking, a permission structure for believing what you wanted to believe regardless of the evidence. James was at pains to clarify and the clarifications are more interesting than the objections. He was not, he insisted, arguing for believing things against the evidence. He was arguing something narrower, that in genuine cases of uncertainty, cases where the evidence is insufficient to compel belief one way or the other, the human will plays a legitimate role in the formation of belief, and that pretending otherwise was itself a kind of dishonesty. The specific case he had in mind was not supernatural claims, but the question of whether life was worth living. This was not an abstract question for James. He had spent years in which the answer seemed clearly to be no, and had recovered, in part, through the deliberate act of choosing to believe otherwise. His diary entry of the 30th of April 1870 was the founding document of this argument, lived before it was theorized. The skeptic who refuses to commit until the evidence is conclusive, James argued, misunderstands the nature of many of the most important decisions a person faces. In those decisions, the choice to trust someone, to commit to a relationship, to believe that the effort being made is meaningful, the act of commitment itself changes the evidence. The trust creates the trustworthiness in some cases. The commitment to the relationship creates the conditions under which the relationship can actually become what it needs to be. The belief that the effort matters makes the difference to the effort. He was describing a genuine epistemological feature of situations where the outcome depends on the believer. This is not a license for irrationality. It is an observation about a specific class of situation where the standard empiricist prescription, suspend judgment until the evidence compels, is itself a choice with its own consequences. In a life, this has a shape. The person who waits for certainty before committing will wait a very long time. The person who acts on the best available understanding while remaining open to revision will accumulate a very different kind of knowledge. James had committed, at 30, to the belief that his life was worth living, with no sufficient evidence. The evidence came afterward, because he was there to gather it. You are here tonight. That is its own quiet act of will in the direction of continuing. Kierkegaard had argued, 50 years before James, that the self was not a given but an achievement, that the person had to continually choose to become themselves, that the failure to choose was itself a choice in the direction of not being. James did not cite Kierkegaard often, but the structural similarity is striking. Both men were interested in the act of choosing as the founding event of selfhood, and both men had encountered in their own lives the possibility that the choice might not be made. James made the choice in 1870 and kept making it, not once and forever. That is not how choices of this kind work. But again and again and again. Each time the old darkness returned with its convincing argument that the effort was futile, the will was engaged one more time in the direction of continuing. He described this in a letter to his sister Alice, who spent much of her adult life bedridden with illness, as the maintenance of a certain inner temperature. Not warmth exactly, he did not recommend forced optimism. A temperature that stayed just above the point at which forward motion ceased. That was, in his view, the minimum that the will to believe had to sustain. just above the point of stopping. Everything else built on that foundation. Chapter 22. What it costs to remain uncertain. We planted something at the very beginning of this night. A question about a diary entry, the 30th of April, 1870. A young man so far inside the dark that even the word for what he felt, despair, seemed too clean for it. Something more cellular, more physical, more like a disturbance in the structure of the self. The entry reads in full, "I think that yesterday was a crisis in my life. I finished the first part of Renouvilier's second essay and see no reason why his definition of free will, the sustaining of a thought because I choose to, when I might have other thoughts, need be the definition of an MI. Illusion. At any rate, I will assume for the present, until next year, that it is no illusion. My first act of free will shall be to believe in free will." He was 27 years old. He had been sick for years. He had studied medicine and not practiced. He had failed to complete his doctoral work. He had returned from a failed expedition to Brazil and a worsening depression in Germany. He had come back to his father's house in Cambridge, a person with no clear path and a nervous system that was making ordinary life feel like wading through water. Charles Renouvier was a French philosopher James had discovered while ill in his room, and what Renouvier offered him was a door, not a solution, a door. The possibility that the will could choose its next thought, that the mental state of despair was not the fixed ground of reality, but a condition, and that a condition could be modified. James walked through the door. Not completely, not immediately. The recovery was gradual and imperfect, and punctuated by returns of the dark. He would write, years later, that he never fully shook the knowledge of what it felt like to be on the edge of the abyss, but he walked through the door, and then again, and then again. The cost of remaining uncertain, the cost of the position that waited for conclusive evidence before choosing to continue, was something James had nearly paid in full. He chose instead the will to believe, directed first at the smallest possible object, the existence of the will itself. This is what the diary entry is. Not a philosophical argument, an act. And what it tells us is something about the relationship between belief and the conditions for living. The prior question, am I going to be here to learn whether the belief was warranted, is itself answered by the act of believing. You cannot empirically test whether your life is worth continuing without continuing it. James continued. The test returned its results over the following decades. They were not uncomplicated, but they were sufficient. He would want you to know that the door is always the same door. Rollo May, the existential psychologist, would later describe what he called the courage to create, the act of stepping into the unknown with no guarantee of what would be found there. He was describing artists, but he was describing something James had documented in a different register. The courage required simply to continue forward in a life when forward motion is not obviously warranted. The courage James was describing was quieter than May's. It was not the courage of the artist confronting the blank page, or the revolutionary confronting a corrupt institution. It was the smaller, domestic courage of the person who gets out of bed on the hard day, who chooses to engage when withdrawal would be easier, who makes the small decisions toward life rather than away from it on days when life does not offer strong arguments for itself. He had been that person. He knew the weight of it. He also knew, and this was the knowledge he kept offering in his later work, in the letters, in the lectures, in the philosophy, that the weight changed, that the sustained practice of choosing to continue, accumulated over years, produced a person who was less frightened of the dark than the person who had first made the choice in 1870. The door. He walked through it. You are on the same side of it now. Chapter 23. Pragmatism and the question you actually need. In 1906 and 1907, James delivered and then published a series of lectures under the title Pragmatism, a new name for some old ways of thinking. He was in his mid-60s, in uncertain health, and he was attempting something he had been working toward for most of his intellectual life, a philosophy that was both rigorously honest and livably human. The pragmatist method, as James described it, is not a doctrine, but a way of settling philosophical disputes. When you encounter a question, a metaphysical debate, a disagreement about values, a philosophical position that claims truth, the pragmatist asks, what practical difference would it make to anyone if this were true rather than false? What concrete consequences follow from it? If there is no practical difference, if the question would make no difference to any moment of lived experience, then the question is, at least for human purposes, not worth arguing about. This sounds reductive. James was aware of how it sounded. He spent considerable effort distinguishing the pragmatist from the crass materialist who only cared about money or convenience. Practical consequences, in his usage, included the consequences for the texture of a life, the quality of experience, the character of the person doing the believing. These were not lesser matters. The question he was most interested in throughout his career was what he sometimes called the question of the whole. Whether there was any purpose or meaning in the universe, any grounding for human values, any reason to take the effort of living seriously. He did not claim to resolve this question. He claimed to have found a way of living with it. The pragmatist answer to the question of meaning is not that the universe has been shown to have it or shown to lack it. The pragmatist answer is, what kind of person do you become if you live as if it has? And what kind of person do you become if you live as if it does not? The consequences of these two stances, accumulated over a lifetime, are themselves part of what we mean by evidence. James noticed that people who lived as if their actions had meaning tended to live, over time, more coherently. They were more able to bear difficulty, more able to sustain effort, more able to maintain relationships through the long, ordinary stretches where no transcendent justification was being offered. Whether or not this constituted proof of anything metaphysical, it constituted, in James's view, a genuine, practical argument. He was not asking anyone to pretend. He was observing that what you choose to attend to, what you choose to believe, what you choose to sustain, These choices are not mere reactions to a prior reality. They are partly constitutive of it. Tonight, the practical question is simpler than the metaphysical one. What does rest produce in you? What does the deliberate practice of stillness, repeated on enough nights, accumulate over time? James would trust that data. He had learned to trust it through decades of disappointment with the alternative. The alternative was the philosophical ideal, the carefully argued position, the logically coherent system, the truth established by pure reason, operating in isolation from the mess of actual experience. He had watched that alternative produce beautiful, useless conclusions about a world that did not exist. The world that existed was irreducibly plural, stubbornly particular, and responsive to attention in ways that pure reason could not predict. You had to be in it. You had to try things. You had to notice what the trying produced. And then you had to be honest about the results, even when the results contradicted what you had hoped to find. This was pragmatism as James lived it, not a comfortable philosophy despite its reputation for accommodation, a demanding one because it required you to look at the actual consequences of your actual beliefs in your actual life and take those consequences seriously as evidence. Tonight, the consequences of this practice, the nightly return to stillness, the regular placing of attention somewhere quieter, are data. Small data from one night. But the series accumulates. James would say, follow it. See where it leads. Trust what it produces in the texture of your days. That is the whole method, applied to the smallest possible laboratory. Chapter 24. The philosophy that stays with you. If your mind has drifted tonight across any of the territory we have covered, across the faces and dates and ideas that have moved through these hours, that is exactly as it should be. The mind at the edge of sleep does not process the way it does in daylight. Come back gently. We are still here. There is no progress to make up. James, characteristically, had something to say about the kind of knowledge that stays with us. He distinguished between knowledge about and knowledge of what philosophers call, in the Latin he preferred not to use, acquaintance versus description. Knowledge about something is propositional. You can state it in a sentence, verify it, file it. You know about Spinoza's excommunication. You know about Thoreau's 3 chairs. You know about the year James almost did not continue. Knowledge of something is different. It is experiential. It lives in the body as well as the mind. It cannot be fully stated in a proposition because the proposition is only a pointer towards something that was actually encountered. James believed and argued at length that the deepest philosophical knowledge, the kind that actually changes how a person lives, how a person wakes up in the morning and moves through a day, was the second kind. It came from experience that had been lived through, not information that had been accumulated. This was part of his problem with the academic philosophy of his era. The philosopher who knows about suffering is not the same as the person who has been inside it. The philosopher who knows about freedom is not the same as the person who has exercised it in a moment of genuine difficulty. The philosopher who knows about the will is not the same as the person who has deployed it when deploying it felt impossible. James was both, which is why his philosophy has the texture it does. The arguments are careful and the logic is rigorous, but underneath them is the knowledge of, the residue of, having actually been in the states he is describing and having come back from them with something. What stays with you from tonight will not be a list of propositions. It will be a texture, a quality of thought at a certain hour, the sense of a mind that sat with hard questions and did not flinch. That is a knowledge of, not a knowledge about. You do not need to hold any specific idea. You only need to have been here. The night will do the rest. Alfred Adler, who worked in the generation after James, though from a very different tradition, wrote that what mattered in therapy was not the insights the patient could articulate, but the ones that had worked their way into the body's way of moving through the world. The insight that changed the posture, that changed the habitual gesture, that changed the unconscious assumptions a person carried, that was the knowledge that had done its work. James would have agreed. His pragmatist theory of knowledge was partly an argument for this kind of embodied knowing. True beliefs, ideas that actually worked in the texture of a life, were not stored in the verbal memory as propositions. They were stored in the habits, in the reflexes, in the way a person moved towards some things and away from others without deliberation. The things you have heard tonight, or half heard, or received in the drifting state between waking and sleep, are being processed by a system more intelligent than the verbal mind. They are being placed where they need to go without your having to direct the placement. Sleep is, among other things, a vast consolidation process. What the day gathered, the night arranges. James found this astonishing and, in his better years, trusted it. So can you. Chapter 25. A lecture hall in 1906. It is November 1906. Lowell Institute, Boston. The room is full in a way that surprises even the organizers. James is 64 years old, a little heavy now, the beard fully grey, the eyes still very alive. He has been a famous man for 20 years. The principles made him famous in psychology. The varieties made him famous beyond it. Now he is here to talk about something he has been carrying for a long time. The idea of pragmatism, which he believes is not a theory, but a way of navigating the extraordinary mess of being a thinking person in a universe that offers more questions than answers. He is not a commanding lecturer in the conventional sense. He does not declaim from the podium. He talks. He uses his hands. He loses his place occasionally and finds it again. He laughs at the absurdity of what he is attempting. He is known in Boston and Cambridge and New York for making difficult ideas feel like conversations rather than instructions. The students in the room, and there are students, alongside the professional philosophers and the curious public, are struck by the same quality that students in his Harvard classrooms have noted for decades. He is present. He is genuinely working. He is not delivering settled truth from a height. He is thinking alongside you in real time, and the thinking has the quality of actual thought rather than rehearsed performance. His friend, the philosopher Josiah Royce, was his great intellectual adversary and lifelong companion. They argued for decades about idealism versus pragmatism, about the nature of the absolute, about whether reality required a coherent whole or could sustain genuine plurality. Their arguments were famous within the philosophy department, sometimes public, always marked by a genuine affection that philosophy rarely managed. They would disagree entirely and remain friends. James found this admirable and slightly amazing. The lectures James gave in November 1906 would be published the following year, with a dedication to John Stuart Mill. They would sell in a way philosophy rarely sells. They would be translated, argued with, distorted, misrepresented, defended. They would make pragmatism a household word in a way that was, by James's own account, both gratifying and slightly alarming. But in the lecture hall, in November, in the warmth of a room where ideas were genuinely in the air, he was simply a man in his 60s who had been thinking hard about how to live and had some things to report. His voice, in every account, was gentle. Not soft, gentle. The distinction mattered. He was not mild. He was deliberate. He said what he meant and meant what he said, and the gentleness was in the pace, the willingness to slow down at the hard parts, to repeat the difficult phrase one more time, to trust that the person in front of him was capable of following if given the time. That trust was itself a form of respect. He offered it to the room. Josiah Royce, sitting somewhere in that same Cambridge philosophical atmosphere, was James's most consistent interlocutor. They had been colleagues for more than 30 years, and the disagreements between them, Royce arguing for the absolute, James for the irreducible plurality of the real, had shaped American philosophy as much as either man's individual work. The argument was never resolved. They were both still making it when James died. What James left behind in that Boston lecture hall in 1906 was not a solved system, but a set of questions so well formulated that they continue to generate genuine philosophy for decades afterward. Dewey refined them. Peirce had already contributed to them. A century later, figures as different from one another as Richard Rorty and Hilary Putnam were still working within the territory James had opened. But in the hall, at 64, what he was doing was simpler than intellectual legacy. He was thinking out loud in a room full of people who were willing to think with him. He found that worth doing for its own sake. He had always found it worth doing, even on the hard days. The willingness to bring the question into the room unresolved and work on it together, that was the practice and the philosophy and the life all at once. Chapter 26. What James said about truth. The controversy around pragmatism focused more than anything else on the theory of truth. James said, "True ideas are ideas that work." Truth is not a static correspondence between a proposition and some fixed reality. Truth is what happens to an idea when it enters the stream of experience and makes itself useful. An idea is true insofar as it enables us to navigate our world effectively. to predict what will happen, to coordinate with others, to sustain what needs to be sustained. The objection, articulated most clearly by Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, was that this collapsed truth into usefulness, and usefulness was not truth. A false idea could be useful. A true idea could be useless. The pragmatist definition seemed to make truth too easy, too convenient, too available for manipulation by anyone who found a convenient story and made it work. James's response was that the objectors were thinking of usefulness in too narrow a sense. Long-run usefulness, in his account, was not easily distinguished from truth. An idea that consistently and reliably enabled good predictions and successful navigation of reality was, over time, exactly what we meant by a true idea. The gap the critics were pointing to between the useful and the true was real in the short run, in the case of convenient fictions, but closed over time under the pressure of experience. He also made a point that his critics sometimes missed. He was not replacing truth with usefulness. He was describing what we actually do when we settle questions of truth. We test, we predict, we observe, we adjust. We treat our ideas as instruments for navigating the world. The pragmatist is not saying anything new about truth, only making explicit what is already happening. His friend Gertrude Stein, who attended his courses at Harvard and remained devoted to him for life, said that she had never met anyone who more completely exemplified what he taught. He lived pragmatically. He tested his ideas by living them. He revised when the living showed him something the theory had missed. The theory of truth is a long conversation, and tonight is not the place for its full examination. What is worth carrying from it at this hour is simpler. James was saying, the ideas that serve you, that enable you to navigate your actual life with more honesty, more steadiness, more capacity for the things that matter, those are the ones worth holding. The ones that sound impressive but produce nothing in the texture of your days are, whatever their formal validity, not useful in the way he cared about. What idea would serve you tonight? What is already serving you without your having noticed it? The question does not require an answer in words. It can simply rest here, open, as the night continues. John Dewey extended James's pragmatism into a complete philosophy of inquiry, and one of his central contributions was the observation that the best questions did not demand immediate answers. Good questions, in Dewey's view, were productive disturbances. They reorganized the field of experience around a new possibility, and the reorganization itself was valuable regardless of whether the explicit answer ever arrived. James had been living this before Dewey theorized it. The question of free will, planted at 27, still open at 68, had organized his entire intellectual life into a sustained investigation whose value was not contingent on resolution. The investigation itself was the thing. The carrying of the open question through a long life was what had made the life what it was. You carry your own open questions. Tonight is not the night to resolve them. Tonight is one of the nights when the carrying is its own sufficient act. When being a person who can sit with the unresolved, without forcing it closed, is not a failure of decisiveness, but a kind of wisdom. James held that wisdom all his life. It was not easy for him to hold. He was, by temperament, someone who wanted to resolve, to conclude, to deliver the answer. But he learned, through decades of practice, to sit with the question that did not yet have its answer, and to find that the sitting was, in its own way, a form of arriving. Chapter 27. The Varieties of Experience. And here we reach the other thread left open at the beginning. The sick soul and the healthy soul, left as two temperaments, two registers, two ways of inhabiting existence. James, in the Varieties, argued that neither was superior in the simple sense. The healthy-minded person had an ease and a lightness that the sick soul could not manufacture. But the sick soul, by virtue of its knowledge of the darkness, had a depth and a range that the healthy-minded person could not easily reach. The person who has never doubted whether existence is worth inhabiting is missing something that the person who has inhabited that doubt and survived it carries forward. He called the person who had passed through the darkness and emerged on the other side twice born. Not because they were special, and not because the passage was chosen, but because they had a knowledge that could only be acquired by going. The twice-born person knows the darkness is real. They know the weight. They have not looked away from it, or explained it away, or avoided it by keeping busy. And they have come through it not to a naive optimism, not to the healthy-minded person's natural ease, but to something harder and more durable, a peace that is not the absence of knowledge of darkness, but the presence of something that holds alongside it. James never claimed to be fully twice born. He was, in his later years, still sometimes visited by the old darkness. But he knew himself to be different in some fundamental way from the person who had written in the diary in 1870. That person was in freefall. The later James had ground beneath him. Not always solid, not always stable, but ground. The ground was not a theology, though he had enormous respect for people for whom theology provided the ground. The ground was a practice, the daily practice of directing attention, of making the small choice toward life rather than away from it, of placing one foot in front of the other in the dark as a form of commitment to the continuing. He had a phrase for it that does not appear in the formal works but runs through the letters: the will toward the affirmative, not naive affirmation, not pretending the shadows were not there, but choosing in the daily acts of attention and choice to face toward the light rather than away from it. This is what is available at 3 a.m. or midnight or whatever the hour is wherever you are. Not certainty, not resolution. The will toward the affirmative. The daily small choice. Made again. Carl Rogers, who was building his person-centered approach to therapy around the same years that the academic world was absorbing and debating James's legacy, arrived at a similar structure from a clinical direction. He found, in years of listening to people in genuine difficulty, that the turning point was rarely the grand insight or the moment of dramatic catharsis. It was the quieter moment when the person accepted themselves with enough completeness to take the next small step, not because the problems were solved, but because the self was, for a moment, no longer fighting itself. James had come to the same place through philosophy. The will toward the affirmative was not optimism. It was not the assertion that everything was fine or that the difficulties were not real. It was the choice, made in the full knowledge of the difficulties, to face in the direction of the possible. Wherever you are in the spectrum between the healthy-minded and the sick soul tonight, that choice is available, not as a demand, as a door, always there, always the same door. You have been walking in its direction for some time tonight. The direction is its own small arrival. Hold that as we move into the final part of this night. Chapter 28. When the mystical moment comes. James devoted a substantial portion of the Varieties to what he called mystical states of consciousness, and his treatment of them is unusual for a scientist and a philosopher. He took them seriously. He was not credulous. He did not assume that mystical states produced reliable information about the structure of the universe, or that their content could be accepted at face value as reports on the divine. He was, in his philosophical work, agnostic about what was actually happening in a mystical experience, whether the experiencer was genuinely encountering something outside themselves, or whether the experience was a product of the mind's own depths, or whether these two possibilities were even distinguishable. But he was clear about one thing. Mystical states were real experiences, with real effects on the people who had them. And those effects were sufficiently consistent across traditions and centuries that they demanded serious attention. He identified 4 marks of the mystical state. The first was ineffability. The experience could not be adequately described in language. It had to be experienced directly, and any description fell short of the thing itself. The second was a noetic quality. Mystical states felt like genuine knowledge, not mere feeling. They conveyed a sense of insight into deep truths that remained convincing even after the state had passed. The third was transience. They did not last. The state could not be sustained voluntarily for more than a few minutes, after which the ordinary consciousness resumed. The fourth was passivity. The experiencer felt that their own will had been suspended. Something larger was holding and carrying them. The combination of these 4 features produced, James noted, a remarkably consistent phenomenology across the most diverse cultural and religious contexts. A Christian mystic in 14th century Germany, a Sufi in 12th century Persia, a Vedantic practitioner in 19th century India, a psychologist in a Boston armchair in the 1890s who had inhaled nitrous oxide and found himself briefly in an overwhelming sense of cosmic unity, all reported the same basic structure. James had the nitrous oxide experience himself. He wrote about it with some embarrassment and complete honesty. Under the gas, he had felt an absolute conviction of the meaningfulness and unity of everything, an experience of reconciliation between all the contradictions he had spent his life navigating, and a sense that something enormous was on the verge of being understood. And then the gas wore off, and the experience dissolved into ordinary waking consciousness, leaving behind only the memory of having been somewhere extraordinary, and the conviction that what had been felt however inaccessible to description, was not nothing. He spent years wondering what to do with that experience. It did not convert him. It did not produce a theological position, but it broadened his sense of what consciousness was capable of and left him permanently reluctant to draw the borders of the possible too tightly. What is available tonight, without chemicals or crisis or theological framework, is something much smaller than what James was describing. But it is not unrelated. There are states of mind in the very late hours that are their own kind of edge. The boundary between waking and sleeping, when the mind is still present but no longer managing, produces its own quality of awareness. Thoughts arrive without being summoned. Connections form that would not form in daylight. The grip of the ordinary self loosens slightly, and something both more and less than the everyday I is briefly available. James would be curious about that state. He would not tell you what it means. He would only ask you to notice it. Notice what comes in the loosening. Chapter 29. The mind that stops fighting the stream. We left something unfinished early in this night. The question of the word. James called the flow of mental life a stream, not a river, not a current, a stream. The difference matters, and it is not merely stylistic. A river moves through a defined channel between fixed banks toward a known destination. The banks are given. The direction is given. The river is contained by its own geography. A stream is different. A stream finds its way. It moves around obstacles, changes direction in response to the terrain it encounters, pools in some places and rushes in others, loses itself temporarily in the ground only to re-emerge further along. A stream is not directed by its channel. A stream creates its channel over time by virtue of its own flowing. James chose the word deliberately. He was trying to describe the movement of thought as it actually felt from the inside, not as a sequence of discrete beads on a string, not as a chain of causes and effects, not as a river following a fixed course, but as something more like a stream, continuous, variable, responsive, generative. The dominant model of consciousness in James's day was the associationist model, associated with the British empiricists who preceded him, Locke, Hume, Bain, Spencer. In that model, mental life consisted of discrete elements, sensations, perceptions, ideas that were strung together by associations. A thought led to another thought through the mechanism of similarity or contiguity. The chain of mental life was assembled from its links. James's complaint was that this model missed everything that was most characteristic about actual thinking. The most important feature of consciousness, he argued, was not its elements, but its continuity, the fact that it was always already in motion, never arriving from stillness, never actually composed of discrete stopping points. Even what felt like a pause in thought was not an absence of consciousness, but a change in its quality, a fallow moment in a continuous movement. The stream never stopped flowing, even in sleep. Even in the states most resembling unconsciousness, some dim form of awareness persisted and carried the self from one moment to the next. This was in part why identity was possible across time. You woke in the morning as the same person who went to sleep because the stream had continued in some fashion through the night. The you who emerges in the morning is connected to the you who closed their eyes not by a chain of stored memories, but by an unbroken, if radically altered stream of continuous experience. The stream cannot be stopped. It can only be directed more or less wisely, more or less gently toward what it needs. Tonight, the stream is slowing, not stopping. The current is gentler than it has been all day. The banks on either side are still there, but further apart now, and the water moves more widely through a quieter landscape. This is the state James could describe, but not produce. You are already in it. Let the stream slow. Let the current find its own course through the dark. Heraclitus, who lived 25 centuries before James in Ephesus, had made the river his central image for the same reason. Not because rivers were poetic, but because they were accurate. You cannot step into the same river twice, he said, because the water is always different, and also because you are always different. The river and the stepper are both in motion. What appears to be a fixed crossing is actually two streams briefly meeting. James knew the Heraclitean fragment. He quoted it in effect in the Principles in the chapter on consciousness. The stream of thought is exactly the stream of Heraclitus applied to the interior life. Never the same moment twice, always in motion, always carrying forward elements of what came before while being already something new. What Heraclitus and James both found in the stream image was a reconciliation with impermanence. The stream does not try to be otherwise. It does not resist its own motion. It does not mourn the water that has passed downstream already, or anticipate with anxiety the water that has not yet arrived. It simply moves through its own nature, at its own pace, finding the lower ground, which is not a failure, but the way of water. The word was stream, and the mind, in the quiet late hours, is already finding its lower ground. The word was stream. Now you know why. Chapter 30, on tired days. If your mind has been travelling tonight through Cambridge in 1870, through a lecture hall in Boston, through the strange country of the mystical states and the pragmatic theory of truth, come back for a moment. We are almost through. There is only a little farther to go. James wrote almost nothing directly about rest. This is notable for a man whose health was so frequently precarious, who spent so much of his career working around periods of exhaustion and nervous collapse, who understood better than most the consequences of a body and mind pushed beyond what it could sustain. His letters contain something, though. He wrote in one of the late letters that he had learned, later than he should have, that there was a particular wisdom in the unproductive day. Not the day of strategic rest, not the deliberately planned recovery period that served future production, but the day that was simply tired. The day that required nothing of him, produced nothing, advanced no argument, completed no project, and happened anyway as a fact of organic life. He had come, by his mid-60s, to find a particular peace in those days. He had stopped measuring them against the productive days and started letting them be what they were. A different kind of day, with its own particular color and quality. This was not easy for him. He was, by temperament and by formation, an achiever. The son of a man who had thought enormously about the nature of spiritual experience, and the daughter of a family that produced a novelist of the first rank, the brother of Henry, who was always writing. The James household was not idle. The James household was a place where ideas and work were the primary currency, and where not working produced its own form of anxiety. So the acceptance of the tired day was genuinely one. It was not his natural state. It was something he arrived at by following the logic of his own philosophy to its conclusion. Pragmatism said, "What are the consequences?" The consequences of treating the tired day as a failure were guilt, continued expenditure of diminishing resources, and a quality of presence that was both degraded and denied. The consequences of treating the tired day as simply what was happening, an organic fact, neither good nor bad, a day in which the stream was moving quietly, were a day that was actually lived, and a body that received something closer to what it needed. He concluded, late, that he had been wrong for decades about the tired day. The wrong he was correcting was not a philosophical error, it was a habit of self-treatment that had run without examination. You may be having a tired day right now, not in the negative sense, in the organic sense. The sense of a body that has done what bodies do, processed what the day contained, and arrived at the natural terminus of its available energy. This is not a failure to be managed, it is an evening doing exactly what evenings do. James, from the late letters, would recognize this. He would sit with you in it without trying to change it. Weil, who died at 34 and packed a lifetime of ethical seriousness into the time she had, wrote that there were certain kinds of attention that were only available in states of tiredness and depletion, states where the usual defenses were down and the world's suffering could be received more directly. She did not recommend exhaustion, but she noticed that something particular was available in the diminished state that was not available in the state of full capability. James would not have gone quite this far. He was more protective of the body than Weil tended to be of her own. But he understood the specific quality of perception available at the edge of depletion. The way the mind, stripped of its usual energy for projection and control, could receive what was actually there with a directness that the busy hours prevented. The tired day, in this reading, is not a failure of productivity. It is a different mode of reception, quieter, less defended, more available to what the moment actually contains rather than what the mind projects onto it. This is one version of what rest is for. Not only the recovery of energy for future expenditure, the temporary availability of a different kind of seeing. Rest now. Something is available here that the busy hours do not offer. Rest now for a while. We are very nearly at the end. Chapter 31. What William James taught by surviving. The last thing James published before he died in August 1910, at home in New Hampshire, in the house he had built and loved, was A Pluralistic Universe, a set of lectures in which he argued, finally and fully, against the monism that claimed reality must be, at its deepest level, one thing. He believed, and had always believed, in the plurality of the real. More than one thing could be true at once. More than one kind of experience was genuine. The universe was not a system to be solved, but a neighborhood to be explored. He had one more book in progress when he died, Some Problems of Philosophy, which he left detailed instructions to publish unfinished, and a characteristic note to his brother Henry asking him to add a preface explaining that the book was not complete. Even in dying, he wanted to be accurate about what was and was not finished. He died at 68. By the standards of his family's health history, this was not early. By the standards of what he wanted to do, it was. What he taught by surviving, by making it from the diary of 1870 to the lectures of 1906, from the paralysis of his 20s to the extraordinary productivity of his middle and later years, was not primarily a set of propositions. It was a demonstration. A demonstration that the person who cannot see a path forward is not necessarily the person there is no path forward for. The person in the dark of 1870 could not have described what was coming, the principles, the varieties, the lectures, the letters, the students who would carry the ideas forward into the 20th century and beyond. None of it was visible. Only the next small act was visible, the decision to believe for 1 year that the will was real. Gertrude Stein, who studied under him, wrote that his class had taught her that writing was thinking, and that thinking was a form of attention, and that attention was a form of love. She attributed these ideas to him, and he might have been surprised by the genealogy, but not, I think, by the ideas themselves. John Dewey built a philosophy of education on the pragmatist foundation James had laid. George Santayana, who sat in James's classes and then spent a long career partly arguing against him, said that he could not have been who he was without James, which was more honest than most intellectual debts. The lineage extends in every direction from the Cambridge of the 1880s and 1890s. Not because James was correct about everything, he was not, but because he was genuinely thinking, and genuine thinking propagates. He had a word for the people he most admired, the ones in whose company he felt the specific pleasure of being met by a mind that was actually engaged. He called them, in letters, the live ones, as opposed to the dead ones who were going through the intellectual motions without anything at stake. The live ones cared. They were risking something in the thinking. The conclusion actually mattered to them, which meant the inquiry was real. He counted himself on the good days among the live ones. He counted Royce among them. He counted his students who had gone on to do serious work, Dewey, Santayana, Gertrude Stein, in her own way. He counted the people who had written to him from their own difficulty, reaching for the philosophy not as an academic exercise, but as something they actually needed to navigate an actual life. That reaching from the difficulty toward the thinking was what he had been doing since 1870. He was still doing it in 1910, in the months before he died, finishing what he could of the last book, telling his brother Henry in the letters that there was still something to say, and he was not finished saying it. The not finished was his most honest statement about the work. None of it was finished. The stream continues past any particular person's bank. You are doing the thinking tonight. You are, in your quiet way, one of the live ones. What he taught by surviving was that the genuine thinking is worth doing, even when it produces no immediate certainty, even when the conclusion reached is that the universe is plural, irreducible, and resistant to final answers. The thinking was the thing. The sustained attention to hard questions was itself a form of being alive in the fullest sense available. You are doing it tonight, in the dark, in the quiet. That is enough. Chapter 32. The letter he would have written you. James wrote letters the way some people talk in conversation, generously, attentively, with a quality of presence that made the recipient feel genuinely seen. He wrote to students who had written to him in distress. He wrote to friends in crisis. He wrote to philosophers he disagreed with, disagreeing warmly. He wrote to his brother Henry in long, fond, sometimes exasperated exchanges that documented one of the more remarkable sibling correspondences in the history of letters. If he had known you were here tonight, tired, at the edge of sleep, carrying what the day has left, he would have written, not with advice. That was not his mode. He was not a prescriber. He was an accompanier. He would have written something about the validity of the night itself, about how the dark hours were not empty or wasted, but their own kind of life, their own quality of consciousness, with their own forms of knowing available that the bright hours crowded out. He valued this. He thought the culture of his time undervalued it, and he thought the same thing is probably true of most times. He would have written about the stream, about how the particular character of thought in the late hours was its own thing. Not degraded daylight thought, not failed productivity, but a different mode, looser, more associative, more willing to let connections form across distances it would not cross in the day. He would have written, and this would have been the heart of the letter, about the small act of continuing, about how survival is underrated as an achievement, how the simple fact of continuing to carry the questions, not answering them, not resolving them, just carrying them forward into the next day and the day after that, was itself a form of philosophical work. That the life continued was itself an answer to the question that had once seemed unanswerable. He would not have been sentimental about it. The letter would have had some humor in it, the particular self-deprecating warmth that ran through his correspondence. He knew the darkness. He was not pretending it was comfortable, but he would have wanted you to know that you were doing the right thing. Here, in the dark, at rest, with the questions still open and the night still doing its work. That would have been the letter. He would have signed it as he signed most of his letters, quickly, warmly, with the slight, self-deprecating note that ran through even his most serious correspondence. He was not a solemn man in his private moments. He was, by all accounts of those who knew him well, a man of considerable warmth and humour, genuinely interested in the people he encountered, capable of making them feel that the conversation was the most important thing happening. His student, Gertrude Stein, said that she had never felt so listened to as in his classes, which was an extraordinary thing to say about a man who was simultaneously managing his famous name, his administrative responsibilities at Harvard, his own research, and his chronic health problems. He was present, she said, in a way that was rare. The letter would have had that quality, the feeling of being received, the sense that whoever you are and whatever you are carrying, the receiving was genuine, not therapeutic, not managed. Simply present. He would have ended with something like, "Keep going," but in his particular way, which was never commanding, something more like, "The stream continues, and so, I think, will you." That was the letter. You have it now. Chapter 33, The Habit of Coming Home. The habit, in the end, is this. James spent 30 years teaching that habits could be changed, that the grooves worn by early experience were not fixed, that deliberate practice in the direction of the better behavior would over time move the water. He lived this. He enacted it. He turned the habit of despair slowly into a habit of engagement. The engagement was not uncritical. He remained capable of great darkness. But he had made the return to life, the small daily turning back toward the stream, the practice of choosing attention over avoidance, into a habit that could carry him through the worst. He called the capacity to return from distraction the fundamental psychological skill. The mind wanders. This is not a failing, this is the nature of mind. The skill is not in preventing the wandering. The skill is in the returning, in noticing that the attention has drifted and placing it without drama, without judgment, on what was intended. This is also, he understood, a model for the larger movements of a life. A life drifts. Circumstances pull it. Habits that were not chosen exert their pressure. The person arrives somewhere they did not plan to be. The skill is not in having never drifted. The skill is in the returning. Returning is not dramatic. It does not require a crisis or a resolution or a ceremony. It requires the same thing the smaller returning requires: the noticing and the placing again. You have returned to rest tonight. You have put down some of the day's weight. The noticing has happened and the placing has happened, and you are here. This is the practice. This is enough. It can happen again tomorrow. This is what the habit of returning produces over enough repetitions. Not the absence of wandering. The mind will wander tomorrow as it wandered today, as it wandered every day before today. But the ease of the return. The growing familiarity with the threshold between the drifted state and the placed state. The shortening of the time it takes to notice the drift and make the placing. James measured his life, in some sense, by this shortening. The young man who had spent years unable to return from the dark, who had been so completely in the grip of despair that the return seemed structurally unavailable, had become, by his 60s, a man for whom the return was quick. Not because the darkness never came, because the path back was worn smooth by decades of practice. He would want you to know that the path wears, that each return makes the next return slightly easier, that the work of tonight is not only tonight's work. Karen Horney, working in the generation after James, described what she called the tyranny of the should, the relentless inner demand for what one should feel, should achieve, should be. James had his own version of this tyranny, and he spent a long time fighting it before he found something better than fighting. What he found was the practice, the gentle returning, the non-dramatic choice, made again in the direction of what was actually sustainable. That is available tonight. It will be available tomorrow. The habit deepens. Chapter 34, Stream to Lake. The stream, by this hour, is something different. A stream moves. It has direction. It has the energy of forward motion, the sound of water negotiating with stone, the slight urgency of a thing that is always arriving somewhere. But water, given space and stillness, becomes a lake. The movement does not stop. It slows to something barely perceptible. The surface holds the dark. The depth is available. The thing that was rushing through its channel all day has at last found the wider space where the rushing is no longer needed. Marcus Aurelius, in the tent at the Danube, wrote to himself, "The surface of the mind can be still, even when what is underneath is moving." He was not describing suppression. He was describing depth, the capacity developed over years of returning to maintain a quality of surface stillness even while the depths continued their work. James would not have described it quite this way. His metaphors were more American, more active, more engaged with the texture of experience. But he knew the state. He sought it in his better years, in the Adirondacks, in the long walks, in the evenings in Cambridge when the philosophical pressure was briefly off and there was only the summer dark and the sound of a street outside. Augustine had written, "Our heart is restless until it rests in you." James was not an Augustinian, and the "you" in that sentence was not his. But the restlessness he understood entirely. The arriving at rest, the particular quality of stillness after the long restlessness, he understood that too. Tonight, the stream is becoming the lake. The motion is still there. It does not disappear, but it has found its wider room. Feel the width of it, the surface, the dark above and the dark below. Nothing is being asked of you here. You are simply here. There is something in the late hours that the Zen tradition calls the natural mind, the mind that is not trying to be anything other than what it is. Not the enlightened mind, not the achieved mind, not the mind that has solved its problems, just the mind at rest in its own nature. James was not a Buddhist. But in his later correspondence, he wrote with increasing admiration about the Eastern traditions he was encountering through D.T. Suzuki's early work. and about what he recognized in them as a different approach to the problem he had been studying his whole career. The problem of the self, its solidity, its anxiety, its resistance to the flow of experience. The lake he was arriving at, in these late years and letters, was not enlightenment in any technical sense. It was the simple broadening of the stream into something that moved less urgently and held more. The water was the same water. The motion was the same motion. Something in the landscape had simply widened enough to allow a different quality. That quality is available right now. The same mind that has been moving through the day, that has been running its patterns and performing its social selves and making its small choices, is now in wider territory. The urgency is softer. The banks are further apart. This is the lake. You are in it. There is nowhere else to be. Seneca wrote from his room in Rome that the wise man is at home everywhere. He meant that the interior stillness was portable. It did not depend on circumstances, but on a practice that had become available everywhere. James would have agreed in his way. The habit, once formed deeply enough, carries. You are carrying it. Right now, in the dark, resting. Chapter 35. Before the banks hold still. There is a quality of thought that arrives in this territory. Not ideas exactly, more like the awareness underneath ideas. The sense of being present to the room before the room has resolved into its objects. Before the chest of drawers is a chest of drawers, and the ceiling is a ceiling, and the sound from outside is identified and filed. A brief, wide-open quality of awareness before the categorizing begins. James was interested in this state. In the Principles, he wrote about the fringe, the halo of vague meaning that surrounds every distinct thought, the sense of connections not yet articulated, of relationships hovering just outside explicit recognition. He thought the fringe was at least as important as the focal content of thought, because the fringe was where new connections were born, the insight that had not yet arrived, the understanding that was forming before it had its name. He thought we undervalued the fringe because it was hard to talk about, hard to pin down, hard to represent. The philosophy of his era had focused on what could be stated clearly, and in doing so had missed the enormous proportion of mental life that operated in the non-stated, the not yet formed, the hovering. The state of mind available right now, the threshold state, the loosening before sleep, is one long fringe. Everything is present. Nothing is quite fixed. The day's events are available, but softened. The tomorrow's demands are available, but distant. What is most available is simply the awareness itself, the fact of being conscious, lightly, at the edge of the dark. William James, in his late work, became increasingly interested in what he called pure experience, the moment before the subject-object split, before the I and the world had divided cleanly into perceiver and perceived. He believed, and it was a late, tentative, exploratory belief, that at the root of consciousness was something neither mental nor physical, but prior to both, a flow of pure experience out of which both emerged. He never completed this inquiry. He died with it unfinished, like the last book. But the direction was clear. In the very late hours, the borders loosen. The stream and the lake and the awareness of both become almost the same thing. You are present to the room. The room is present to you. The line between the two is not sharp. This is the state James was pointing toward with the concept of pure experience. Not a mystical annihilation, but a lightening of the ordinary grip. A moment of contact with something prior to the usual divisions. You are in it. Do not try to hold it. It is not a possession. It is simply where you are. Bergson, who was James's contemporary and close friend, they corresponded for years and influenced each other's work in ways both men acknowledged had his own name for this state. He called it intuition, the direct apprehension of duration, of the flowing quality of time from within the flowing. Not the constructed time of clocks and measurements, but lived time, felt from inside the living. James found Bergson's work more exciting than anything else being written by a philosopher in his generation. In the last years, he described himself as moving, philosophically, in the same direction as Bergson, away from the static, the fixed, the given, and toward the flowing, the becoming, the always in process. The state at the threshold of sleep is the state Bergson was pointing toward, the moment before the categorizing mind imposes its structure on experience. The brief contact with duration in the raw, time as it is lived before it is measured. You are in that contact now. The room is still. The categories have softened. What remains is simpler and larger than anything that has been said tonight. James spent his life trying to describe this and admitted in the end that it resisted description. He thought that was finally the right response. To point toward it and then to stop talking. Chapter 36. Now the river slows. We began with a river, or rather, with the question of why James called it a stream. A river would have suggested fixed banks and a known destination. A stream finds its way. Tonight, the stream has found something. Not the destination. There is no destination, James would say. Or rather, the destination keeps moving forward as you approach it, which means the living is in the moving and not in the arriving. But tonight, the stream has found a place to be still in. The day has been processed, as days always are, imperfectly, incompletely, with whatever wisdom was available at the time. The conversations that needed to have been different will have their chance to be different on another day. The things left undone will still be there and will be addressed in the daylight. Tonight, there is nothing left to manage. James used to say in the letters that sleep was the most democratic institution in human life. Every person, from every circumstance, came to it the same way, the banker and the sailor, the philosopher and the farmer, the person at the height of their powers and the person in the long middle of difficulty. All of them arrived, eventually, at the same threshold. All of them crossed it the same way. All of them were held for the hours of the crossing by the same deep, ordinary grace. He did not theologize this. He simply noticed it. He was, to the end, a noticer. And what he noticed in the quiet observation of that democratic threshold was something his pluralism had been pointing toward all along, that beneath all the differences of circumstance and temperament and ability and achievement, there was a shared ground, a common creaturely fact, the need for rest, the capacity for rest, the body's ancient, reliable knowledge of what to do when the conditions were finally right. The conditions are right now. Notice now, if you are still noticing, the weight of the body where it rests. The room around you, familiar and still. The quiet, the breath moving on its own without being asked. James was afraid of death for much of his life, not of dying exactly, but of the ceasing of this, the ceasing of the noticing, the stream going somewhere he could not follow. He died in his room in August in the mountains. His last words, in various accounts, were about not being afraid. Whether that was philosophically earned or simply the mercy of the moment, nobody can know. But he had spent 40 years making the case that the stream persisted, that consciousness was deeper and stranger than any particular configuration of it, that what he had experienced in his lowest moments and in his mystical moments and in the ordinary long middle of a productive life all belonged to the same fundamental thing, the flow of experience that preceded any theory about it. We do not need to resolve that question tonight. We only need to be in the stream. The stream is moving slowly now. The banks have widened. The water is still. You have carried everything tonight that can be carried. The ideas are real. The history is real. The man who wrote in his diary in 1870 and went on to write everything else was real, and his realness is still available, in the way that the thinking of careful people is always available to anyone willing to be quiet enough to receive it. You were quiet enough tonight. That is the whole practice. A thought that keeps returning is not always looking for an answer. Sometimes it is only looking for permission to finally rest. Here is the permission. The river slows. The surface holds the dark. All that James carried, the years of climbing out, the decades of philosophy, the students and the letters and the lectures and the long arguments with Royce about the absolute, all of it was carried by a person who had once been unable to see any reason to continue. The journey from that room in 1870 to the mountains of New Hampshire in August 1910 was made one day at a time, one small choice at a time, one returning at a time. That is available to you. It has always been available to you. And the night, which he loved and understood better than most, is here with you now. Sleep now.